Alright, in the second half of our texturing portion, we're going to look at how I textured the fuse and fuse cap part of the model. And then we'll jump back into Cinema 4D and I'll show you how I applied the materials to our model and also show you some tips to quickly correct your materials instead of jumping back into your editing application. The reason this half of the tutorial is a overview is because it's the exact same techniques we used in the last video, only on a much smaller scale. The Photoshop files will all be detailed and labeled so you can open them up and examine them whenever you want. Okay, let's look at the fuse cap and fuse textures. This is the diffuse texture map for the fuse, and I'm going to show you how I went through texturing it. So I'm going to hide all the layers except for the basic color fill layer. To create the background color texture, I basically imported the fuse reference picture and I sampled a color until I was happy with a basic color. Alright, that's a good one. And then I just created a color fill layer by selecting the adjustment layer button and selecting solid color. Oops, you actually have to press OK. And it'll default to your foreground color. And then I created a custom brush to add a little bit of grunge or texture to it. To create the custom brush, I opened up a image I got from CG Textures. Let me just go back to the original. This is a splatter image. It looks like they just threw some paint against someone's hand and then they took a picture of someone's handprint on a sheet of paper or some plaster. So we want to isolate the red and then turn it black, because when you define a brush, the black is what's actually going to be painted and the white will be transparent. So I went into the channels palette, and the channels work by showing how much of each channel is in the image. So the red channel will be all white because white is a combination of all three channels, and red is 100% red with no green or blue. So the green and blue channels will be black wherever there's any red. So basically you just have to choose one. In this case they're exactly the same since the paint was pure red, so you can just duplicate the blue channel, and then I press Ctrl-L to bring up levels and I lightened it a little bit. Then I brought in the highlight handle and then moved in the midtones a little bit to create a little bit of texture from the default blue channel. So then all you have to do is double click your background image and select image, apply image. Make sure the channel is set to blue copy and the blending mode is not set to multiply, otherwise it will multiply the applied image onto the image that's already in that layer. So set it to normal, then press OK. Now to create a brush, you go to Edit, Define Brush, but right now the image is too big, so we have to make it the maximum size of a brush. So go to Image Size, under Image Size, and set the height to 2000, and make sure Constraint Proportions is on, otherwise it'll only the height and not the width. Press OK, and now we can define a brush. Go to Edit, Define Brush Preset, and name it whatever you think is appropriate. It'll automatically put it in the brushes you have open, so it's right here. And then you can just save the brushes out by clicking the Palette Options button and selecting Save Brushes. I just overwrote the grunge brushes that we got off of getbrushes.com, and then you can just close the image and we can go back to our texture and start painting. To paint, I got two colors, a dark brown and an even darker brown, almost black, and I went into the brush settings and shape dynamics. I set the size jitter to 100%, the minimum diameter to 60% because we don't want the brush to get that small, so 60% is fine. The angle jitter to 23%, and the roundness jitter to 0 because we don't want a flat looking brush. Scattering I set to 251%, and the count I set to 2. Count jitter 100%. And then it's very important to go into color dynamics and set the foreground and background jitter to 100% so that as you paint, it alternates between the foreground and background. It alternates between the foreground and background colors. So once I had a texture I was happy with, this right here, I basically selected add layer mask and I painted with the exact same brush, keeping in mind that when you go into a mask, the foreground and background colors default to black and white, so you need to deselect color dynamics so you only paint with one color at a time. And then to increase the contrast, I got a curves layer, and I basically used the increase contrast preset, and then I went into the channels and I edited them until I was happy with the contrast that it was creating. Basically, when you go into the different channels for the curves adjustment, you're increasing the contrast for that particular channel. So if I brighten up the red, I add more red and it's brighter red pixels, or I can add darker red pixels, so less red and more green. So it's a really nice way to color a texture. And then I added a gradient map and I set it to luminosity because I wanted to increase the contrast even further. So a black and white gradient map at luminosity will try and get the darkest pixels to black and the lightest pixels to white. And then I set that to 29%. And then to make the texture even slighter, I set the actual painted layer to 6% opacity. And then I went to the gradient tool and I selected a green color, a little desaturated, and one of the default gradients is the foreground to transparent. If you don't have it there, you can just go to the palette options button and select reset gradients, replace gradients with the default gradient, and it will be the second one from the left. And then you can just draw your gradient out. I held down shift to draw my gradient out, and then I set to overlay at 14%, and then using our custom brush again, I painted in at a lower opacity, 25%, a lower opacity of the mask, and I painted it out to make it more slight. And then I duplicated the gradient and curves adjustment layers, and then I clip masked them to the curves and gradient by selecting both of them, and then between the curves and gradient layer, holding down Alt and clicking, and then between the curves and gradient layer, holding down Alt and clicking. And that's our base layer. To create the side texture, I wanted to make a folder with everything that we're going to make and then mask it off. So all you have to do is create a new folder and then bring up the UV layer again set to overlay, just like with the grenade texture, and then I just selected our side polygons and then selected add mask, and then I unlinked the mask and group, because when we want to move the group around, we don't want to move the actual mask. So to get a base for the texture, I opened up one of our texture photos that we got from CG Textures, bronze copper. I just imported that in, put it into the side group, and then I ran a filter, noise, dust and scratches, a dust and scratch filter on it twice, and I used 24 for the radius and 21 for the threshold to get a little bit of a textured look to it, so I ran that twice. I just ran it once and selected Control F to run it twice, and we get a smoother, grainier look to our texture. I set that to normal, and then if you look at our reference image, you can see there's a little bit of grime on the fuse. So to paint that out, I just selected two dark colors, well, more mid-tone colors really, and using our splatter brush that we made, I painted it out, making sure I had color dynamics on with the same settings as before, and I set that to a low opacity of 33%. We don't want the grime to be overpowering, we just want it to be a little bit noticeable. So once you're done with the grime, set the opacity to something low so that it's not as noticeable as that. So then I selected green, and just like below, all are labeled, I painted out some green. It's a little bit more desaturated than the brown, and I set it to color dodge to get a little bit of variation in the grime. And that's our side textures. The top and bottom were actually very easy, mostly because they're not going to be seen, since the fuse cap is going to be covering up the top and the top of the grenade is going to be covering up the bottom. So basically, really all you had to do was import our photo texture, run the dust and scratches on it, and for the top, to decrease the seam, since the top of the fuse is lighter, I added a curves adjustment layer and lightened up the texture a little bit. Since the image is so small, I decided to just create a single damage layer using the same techniques we did before. I selected our scratch brush and I drew some random lines out. Holding down Shift. Had an opacity of 100% to create our random scratches. Then, using our custom brush again, I painted in a mask, and then I selected the mask and brought up levels to increase the contrast of the mask. to make it more slight. And the same process we used for the edge, except I painted the edges of where would most likely be scratched. And since it's covered up, it doesn't really have that much edge damage to it, but I did it anyway to show you guys how it would be done. Just like on the grenade, I selected the circle ellipse tool and I selected out the shape and then stroke the path. Let's hide the UVs. And for the AO layer, this is very important. I brought up the hue and saturation dialog window by pressing Ctrl U. I selected colorize, and then for the hue I selected 40. Saturation 42. Pressed OK, and then I set it to multiply, and it's a little too strong, so I set it to 50%. Also, there was some pure black on our AO layer, so using a mask I painted it out. So to create our final layer, I made a new layer, named it Final, Image, Apply Image, and then Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask, using these settings, 60% amount, radius of 1, and a threshold of 0. Set that to 57% opacity because we don't want it to be over sharpened. And remember, this is a circular object, so to get rid of the seam, it's a very quick and easy fix. Just Control click on the mask for the side, create a new layer, go to Image, Apply Image. Alright, let me just hide the mask, and then flip it while you still have it selected. Flip it horizontally by going to Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal, and then we want to create a mask so that only this small part of that layer shows up, so it's basically the flipped side of that, so that when it wraps around our fuse there's no seam. So to do that, all we have to do is get the gradient tool out and making sure we have the black to white default gradient on, create a mask, select reverse, and paint the mask out. Without the mask, with the mask, it fades in to the layer below, and you can see that it's just a flipped version of that side of the image. And then you can go in and making sure we select only the very edge except for 1 or 2 polygons. You can go in and paint a little bit of variation into the mask so that it doesn't look simply just flipped. And I'll show you what that mask looks like. Okay, so to make the specular and bump maps, I just File, Save As, save this fuse underscore bump and fuse underscore specular. For the bump, we wanted the grime to be a little bit raised, so let me just hide everything but the side layer. I took the grime and I inverted it, set it to 100%, so that it would be more visible, inverted the color dodge layer and set it to multiply so that the white would no longer show up. For the top and bottom, I did absolutely nothing. Took the slight damage layer, I merged it by pressing Control E, then I inverted it with Control I. Kept the AO layer the same, added a hue and saturation adjustment layer, and brought saturation all the way down. Then to decrease the contrast, I made a curves adjustment layer, and I decreased the contrast like so. And then using the exact same technique as the diffuse texture, I applied the image, then fixed the seam so that it would be less noticeable. For the specular, I kept the side, top, and bottom textures the same. I merged the slight damage layer, and then I selected color overlay, white for the blending style, and then I merged it again, set it to 50% opacity, or whatever you think is appropriate. Remember, that's the underlying shinier copper that's going to be showing through. Made a hue and saturation layer, and this time for the curves I increased the contrast, so the opposite of the bump curves layer. Then I applied the image, sharpened it, and then fixed the seam. The fuse cap used the exact same process, except since it's a lighter metal, when I brought the copper texture in, I didn't run the dust and scratches over it, decided to keep it the same. For the base, I basically duplicated what I had done for the fuse layer, and then I added curves to make it a little bit lighter, and then set the copper layer to 30%. Then I took a part of the copper at 100% and went into Filter, Pattern Maker, and I selected a small portion like that to create our texture. Let me just show you the whole process. Set this back to 30%. Filter, Pattern Maker, Generate, Filter, Distort, Wave, and that's how we got our little texture right here, except it was a different part of the image. And I set it to screen at 100%, duplicated that layer, and again using our custom brush, painted out a mask, and then painted a slight amount of grime, set to normal at 18%, just to keep with the consistency of the reference image. There's some grime on the fuse cap. Then using the UVs and AO layer, ambient occlusion layer, I started to paint a little bit of burning where the holes for the pin were, and then I selected that and masked it off by pressing Create Mask Layer and inverted it so that it would show up there. And then to stylize the mask a little bit, before I painted, I went to Filter, Brush Strokes, angle strokes, and I used a setting of 0 and 45 and 0. And then using our custom brush again, I started to hand paint the details. For the ambient occlusion layer, I darkened it using curves, so increase the contrast. And then I ran hue and saturation on it, colorize, 25 for the hue, .24 for the saturation, and 0 for the lightness. And then I set it to multiply at 100%. Slight damage, the exact same way, except it's for the random, instead of straight scratches, looking at the reference image, it's a lot softer. So I took our custom brush, painted some white, and then used our custom brush to paint the mask too. I'll show you what the mask looks like. I painted it, ran filter, noise, filter, render, clouds. Remember to have black and white as your foreground colors. Then faded the clouds by going to edit, fade clouds, and setting them to multiply. And then once I had that, I ran levels through it to increase the contrast. And then the edge is the same throughout the rest of the textures. Used our edge brush and painted them. And then to create a little bit of variation, I selected a purple for the foreground and a green for the background, painted out with our custom brush, and Gaussian blurred it at a radius of about 67.4, and set it to normal at 7%, just get a little bit of variation, and then increased the contrast just a little bit using a curves layer. Then I fixed the seam, applied the image, and sharpened. Then I went to File, Save As, FuseCamp_bump, and FuseCamp_specular. For the specular, I basically took the image, deleted all of the adjustment layers so that it ends up being much darker. Then I made new adjustment layers. I took the levels and I moved the midtone slider to 0.7, the highlight slider to 0.29. Let me just show you what that looks like without it. The gradient, I took a gradient map and I made a black and white gradient and set it to normal at 100%. And make sure the slight damage layer is white, so I merged it by pressing Control E. If it's a group, let me just show you what it looks like. Control E, and then I select color overlay and I set it to white or close to white, depending on how specular you want the underlying material to be. I want it to be 100% white just so we could see it as much as possible. I kept the tweak layer and then I fixed the seam, applied the image, and sharpened. Almost the same process for the bump. This time though I inverted everything ran it through curves to decrease the contrast, took the slight damage, and I inverted that, set it to normal at 100%, kept the tweak, and took a gradient map to make it black and white. You can also use hue and saturation, but I like to use a gradient map because it also keeps the contrast of the colored image, whereas hue and saturation does. Then I fixed the seam and applied the image. Also, everything is labeled, so you can go through and pick apart the PSD to see how I did things. Alright, so now we're going to go back into Cinema 4D and I'll show you some tips and techniques to quickly edit your materials inside of Cinema 4D, and also how to add shaders, combine shaders along with your textures that you created in a third-party app. I went ahead and applied our materials and then rendered out 3 different grenades so we can see how the materials look applied. First off, we've got the grenade with everything active, and then we've got the grenade without the fuse cap so we can see the fuse underneath, and then a grenade without anything but the fuse cap. So now I'm going to show you guys how I applied and made the materials. For the grenade, the actual grenade body, it was a pretty easy process. For the color channel, I just had to add in our color texture, which was already in there, so I just had to go in and select reload image, and it reloaded the Photoshop document and updated our texture. Then I had to add in a reflection channel, so I checked the reflection check mark, and then I added in our specular texture. But one thing you'll notice is that on the reference image, the grenade is more reflective towards the edge, so I had to edit the texture a little bit. So once I added in the texture, I selected this button right here, and I selected layer, which automatically put our texture inside of a layer shader. And then to make the grenade a little bit more reflective toward the edge, I added a Fresnel shader by selecting shader, Fresnel, and then you'll notice that it automatically becomes more reflective towards the edge, but we lose our texture, so it's not actually being reflective only where we want it to be. So you need to set the Fresnel shader to, and then we need to edit it by making sure that it's only extra reflective towards near towards the edge and less towards the center. So go into the Fresnel shader by selecting the thumbnail and move this knot in, and then this last knot little into. You might want to move this knot back a little bit. That way it's only a little bit more reflective towards the edge. Let me just delete the extra for now. Okay, for the bump channel, I just activated the bump channel and then added in our texture. It was just like the color channel, real easy and simple. The specular channel, on the other hand, I had to edit it. The default is 50% width and 20% height, so I had to increase the width to 92% and the height to 100%. I also added a little bit of fall off. What fall off does is it actually, just like the name says, falls off our specular, whether it be by doing the inverse or by making sure it slopes off more. I wanted it to slope off a little more, so I added about 4% fall off to our specular, and then I activated our specular color. This is very important because I want the specular to only show up where our texture is. So I activated our specular color, and then I put in our grenade specular texture. And then a little unconventional, I added a little bit of glow, really slight, to the texture, just to add a little bit of life to the metal. For the fuse cap material, the diffuse was a little bit more confusing. When I added in the bitmap fuse cap underscore color. I also put that inside of a layer, and I edited it by using Cinema 4D's built-in effects. First off, when you first add a bitmap to a layer, all you get is the bitmap inside. So I wanted to adjust the brightness and contrast. I could have done this inside of Photoshop, but I feel showing you guys how you can do it inside Maxon Cinema 4D is really important. So all you have to do is make a layer, then select Effect, Brightness and Contrast, and you can start to add some brightness and contrast using the exact same settings you would find in Photoshop. I brought our brightness down a little bit, and then I increased the contrast to 29% just to pop the colors a little bit and make them a little bit more copper toned. And then I sampled a color from our reference image by adding a color shader, and then going into that color shader, selecting the Choose Color Picker dialog window, and then selecting Choose Screen Color. And then I set that layer to multiply at 100%. The reflection was pretty easy. All I did was add the fuse cap specular texture to the reflection channel, and I turned down the mix strength to 10%. Make sure that when you're editing the mix strength of your texture, you turn down the brightness of the default color so that it doesn't show through. The bump, I just added into the bump channel, and then I did the exact same thing I did with the grade for the specular, but with different settings. I kept the height at 100%, but I decreased the width to 70%, and I edited the specular bitmap a little bit, but I decided to go back and get rid of it by just deleting the layer, just like you would in Photoshop. And then I added a little bit of glow, the exact same glow, the grenade. And then for the fuse material, I edited the diffuse fuse underscore color map a little bit by decreasing the brightness and adding some contrast, just to make it a little bit grungier. And then I added some luminance. This is really important because I didn't want it to be extremely dark when we rendered it out. So what I did was check the luminance channel and then decrease the default brightness and add our fuse color into the texture slot and decrease that brightness to 15%. For the reflection, I just put the specular map inside the slot and decreased the mix strength to 30%, and the bump, just like the rest of the materials, was just input inside the texture slot at 20% strength. The specular is the same one from the fuse cap, except I've used the fuse's own specular map. And I also added the same glow to all the objects. One more thing, in the reflection channels you might have noticed I changed the blurriness setting. Cinema 4D doesn't have a way for you to map the blurriness to a texture, so you kind of have to play with these settings until you get something that's as close as possible to your reference image. So for the grenade body, I ended up with 30%. The fuse cap, I ended up with 5% blurriness, and the fuse, I ended up with 25% blurriness. The pin material is pretty simple. All I did was add a gradient with two sampled colors from our reference image, and then I turned the turbulence up to 54%. That kind of just displaces the colors and we get a nice mixing to them. And then I put that in a layer and I increase the brightness and contrast. And then I added a slight bit of reflection by checking the reflection channel, taking it on, and decreasing the default brightness to 0%, and adding a Fresnel shader, but instead of leaving it as the default black and white, I sampled two more colors from our reference image to get a nice colored reflection. I also set that to 36% mix strength and a blurriness of 4%. The specular is the same one from the fuse and fuse cap, but with no specular color, just pure white, which doesn't actually happen in real life, but on the pin object we can get away with it a little bit because we actually have it reflecting on the edge. Alright, so we've applied our materials. After we modeled, unwrapped, and textured a Type 97 grenade, this is the end of the tutorial. I hope you had as much fun as I did going through it, and I hope to make another one. If you have any questions, you can leave a comment, and I'll try to answer it as quickly as possible, or you can email me.